Adjudication law and supervising students in the Juvenile Law Clinic. Mr. Howard currently serves as the chair of the North Carolina Bar Association's Juvenile Justice and Children's Rights section. He is also the former vice chair of the Durham County Juvenile Crime Prevention Council and is a member of the North Carolina Advocates for the Juvenile Justice section. Mr. Howard received his bachelor's degree from Winston-Salem University and his law degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Mr. Howard has been a friend of the forum for some time now, and I can assure you that he is very passionate and sincere about these issues, and we are excited that you're going to close us out today.
Thank you, and I appreciate the privilege and the honor to be before you today. I appreciate Mr. R.B. Smith for selecting me to provide the closing remarks. I'm very passionate about this issue, the collateral consequences of a juvenile adjudication. While I was constructing my remarks, I asked my wife, I said, it really comes down to the collateral consequences of being a black male, doesn't it? She said, well, that's too controversial. You can't say that. I said, well, that's really when we begin to think about it, when we look at what is truly happening, it's impacting brown and black children. It's impacting brown and black families. And if we don't talk about that issue, we're doing ourselves a disservice. So the last conversation, I was just like inspired. Miss Lana Wayne, she said, well, do what you want to do. I said, well, okay, I'll do what I want to do. So what I'm going to do is first engage in a brief conversation about housing policies. So here I am. I live in a housing project. I have a 10-year-old child. He decides to go outside one day and set the bush on fire. Housing project manager finds out, press charges against the child. Child is adjudicated delinquent. I now have to decide whether or not to banish my child from my home, disrupt my family in order to survive and have housing myself. Now, what parent, what middle class or upper middle class or rich parent would have ever had to have that kind of dilemma? It wouldn't happen. So what gives us the authority to tell parents of poverty that we could just uproot your child, take your housing, and treat you like a dog? Now, I'm posing that question to you all. Why should we as a society be allowed to do that? Somebody.
Because we're providing the housing.
Oh, we're providing the housing, right? Okay, what's another reason?
Because we know better than you.
Because we know better than you. Because we're middle class. We're better than you. We come from a better group of parents. You know, we don't allow our parents to burn stuff. Give me another reason. Some of the students, give me a reason. Why should I have the authority to banish this? Well, I guess I'm banishing myself now. banish Mr. Keith Howard and his family from this housing. Truly, think about it. Why are we allowing this?
Deterrence.
Of course, deterrence. We don't want any more bad Keith Juniors running around burning down trees. Next thing you know, he's going to burn down the housing project in the school and the juvenile court system. Well, maybe he should burn down the juvenile. I'm just joking. But I want to engage in a conversation. We had a long day, a lot of information. So help me. Why should I have the authority? Politics. Oh, and that's because poor people typically don't vote, right? Is that the sentiment? Is that what happens? Why are we so quiet?
I think for one thing, they may say that they're doing it for the greater good, for the protection of all their families.
Oh, those bad little black and brown kids running around, terrorizing the community, raping the women, burning down the schools, killing each other, listening to rap music.
Wearing baggy pants.
We're in baggy pants. They just don't know how to dress. What else? I mean, because if we just talk about the collateral consequences of a juvenile adjudication, we're not going to get to the root cause of the problem.
Because some people are valued more than others.
Exactly. Exactly. Those people coming from Mexico, I don't want them here. No, they shouldn't be able to get an education. They shouldn't be able to apply for financial aid. They're not, we don't want them. Then why you have them here? Why are you hiring them? Why are you paying them below minimum wage? Why are you using their children as child labor? All those black kids, they just don't get it right. Their parents are bad. Parents don't know how to parent. They just, just bad people. They come to our schools, they curse, they fight, they do this, they do that, they bring drugs, they do everything bad. They can't do anything right. So we are valued more than they are because of who they are. Now, what role does race play in that? Somebody. Because I'm not going to just talk to you. I'm going to engage you. I'm going to, because you got to help me. I'm a practitioner. I'm not an academic. I'm a practitioner. So I need to know how to utilize this information I just heard, and which is a lot. And I can't wait to read the journal. But I need to know how to take what you've given me and apply it every day. Because I will tell you now, I have a 9-year-old child that's reading below grade level, charged with assault on government official, and I'm gonna probably tell the story a little later. But how am I gonna convey the collateral consequences of an adjudication if he is adjudicated guilty, which more than likely he will be? What do I need to say to this child? And then what do I need to say to his grandmother? Help me. How do I tell them about this information? Because the reality is that the majority of the kids, based on my research, that come through the system have some type of educational problem. They're not going to fully comprehend what you're trying to say to them. They need a lot of support. And I would argue that the juvenile court system is not the place to provide them with that support. As a matter of fact, that same little kid that I represent, I went up to the assistant district attorney and I said, look, I do a lot of work outside of the courtroom. I could help this child get services, mental health services. I could make sure that he is identified as a child with special needs. I could make sure that he has the support systems in the home. Can we just dismiss this or divert this case? She said, no, you don't understand. This is juvenile court. And I said, well, that's why I'm asking you to keep them from out of this court. It is juvenile. I know it's juvenile court. The problem is that the majority of kids, at least in North Carolina, that come through the system are repeat offenders. So if whatever you're doing is working, it's not working well. 58% in 2009, 58% of all kids that went to juvenile court intake had prior referrals. So, yeah, you may be able to provide these kids with services, but something is not working. Something is missing. So I'll take you back to one of my original questions. What role does race play in the initial referral of kids to juvenile court? And yeah, we're gonna be PC, but not right now. For the next 15 minutes, we're gonna talk what people on the street say real. We're gonna have real talk now. Let's talk. What role does race play? We skirt around the issue all day long.
Is it race or is it family? Do those children who are repeat offenders come from a one-parent family or a two-parent family? When I grew up, the parents were somewhat strict and you had an air of independence. I've got to do my own thing so I can get a job in the future. I've got to learn now so I can have a job in the future. It was a strong work ethic and a strong family ethic. And in Detroit, I would say more people are colorblind. You don't see a black person as a black person. He's a Detroiter, gritty. He's a Detroiter.
I think I come from a different perspective, but I think the reason you're finding that the room is so quiet is because we all it's obvious. I mean, the answers are so obvious. There's over-policing, there's self-perception, there's self-hate, there's lack of resources, there's decades, centuries of oppression, institutionalized segregation. There's, I could go on for 40 minutes, 50 minutes easily listing all these things that are so obvious to us that we can't even say them out loud.
I would say that it plays the same role that it plays in poverty and people with disabilities. I see just as many young people in the juvenile justice system who have disabilities and who are poor as I see, the race card. I think that all of what you just said is specific to all of those groups of people. We do what we can to hold down people who are vulnerable and people who don't have resources in order to, they don't have a chance.
What Ms. Ingletti just said, I think what's more difficult is the things that are not so obvious. My personal opinion is that the law itself, at least here in North Carolina, is in part racist, and the policies that govern juvenile delinquency court are racist. I'm not sure they were intentionally racist, but they do have racist outcomes. And intake, the whole structure of intake, I think is, the first thing is, the same person who asks the initial questions to get the child in or out of the court can also possibly be that person's probation officer, which is sort of an inherent conflict of powers, but nobody would think it was a conflict unless they saw who the clientele was coming in. The whole idea, for example, that you're going to send a letter to somebody who may or may not be at that residence anymore, who may or may not respect authority, who may or may not be scared of what's coming in that letter, is not considered. And then once that letter is received or not received and then not responded to, that person automatically goes to court, as a rule. And you gotta think, well, who's more likely to receive that letter? Who's more likely to respond to it or not respond to it? And you don't have access to counsel during the complaint period. And in a lot of places, if you go to the court counselor's office and say, I didn't do it, that's the end of the conversation, and you go to court. There isn't somebody you can talk to who says, well, wait a second. What they're trying to get at is, they're trying to get some information from you, and you may or may not have some issues, but instead of just saying, hey, let's go to court, because they don't, as has been discussed today, they don't know the ramifications of just going to court. And it's been shown in a lot of other jurisdictions, but certainly in this state, that if you're a person of color, the further you go in the system, the further you're going to stay out of the juvenile justice system into the adult system. And it just keeps going and perpetuating. And unfortunately, it's hard to show this on a graph or with statistics, but I think, as was said before, decades, even in this country, centuries of policies have all come down to this. And it's hard to say, well, back in the 1700s, and draw a straight line, but you can see in its application this is what's happening. And it's very difficult to convince administrators and lawmakers that that's the case. It does happen sometimes, every so often. The shackling law was a good example of that. I think one of the pushes there was kids of color being shackled, and I think people realized that, and we got that changed.
Well, Keith, as you know, folks, I'm an attorney here in Durham, practice in juvenile court. I'm familiar with a lot of the folks that are here. And I will tell you, the reason Keith asked that question has such salience in our community as juvenile offenders is because it's not so obvious. It's almost like we have a deliberate amnesia about the history, if we know it. And we often don't know it. And we have so many assumptions about what we're dealing with when he asks that question. It's sort of like Mr. Zagraj says, it's if you are of color, if you encounter the system, you're more likely to encounter it in its worst manifestation. If you get involved in it, you're going to go into it deeply. If you're stopped, you're more likely to be arrested. If you're arrested, you're more likely to face the legal consequences rather than have the matter diverted or go away with a warning. If you go any further than that, you're more likely to be incarcerated, and not just incarcerated, but for longer periods of time than others who may encounter the system, if they get that far in it at all. The real issue is race sort of glossed over because you cannot be colorblind. You have to see what you're dealing with. It's impossible to be colorblind. That's sort of a fiction we shouldn't use. But when we're dealing with people and we get involved in this system, the consequences are so manifest. I will just pose this to you, especially those of you who are thinking about being juvenile offenders or working in the juvenile system. Most of the people that come in the courtroom, as Keith says, if you look at it across the country, the percentages may be a lot lower, but most of the people we see when we go in the courtroom are black kids, usually black males. A lot of Hispanic males, less of anybody else that comes into this courts, unless you're on the tribal area, where you're going to see a bunch of Native Americans. The lawyers that come in there don't look like me, even for the people who are passionate about representing black folks. I find that odd because I have been involved in national organizations. I don't see a whole lot of black male lawyers, but there are a whole lot of black male defendants. It's very important. It may not even be the most salient issue, but it is one that we often forget. So when you're walking into court representing a kid, and I had a kid, and it wasn't a fish. He burned down a school building. So it was arson. Very serious charge. And we had to talk about the whole issue of confidence. If that lawyer in that courtroom, standing before that judge, regardless of who they might be, and it doesn't matter whether they're black, Hispanic, white, those judges aren't going to be concerned about those issues. You are not passionate and understand what you're dealing with and able to represent that child in a way that makes them understand that child's rights are as important as anybody else's. That kid is more likely to end up in training school than to perhaps be treated in the community, which is what I was able to do in that case. And that's why race is so important. You can't just, well, okay, we hope we don't have any negative consequences in this matter. You've got to think about it. You've got to be knowledgeable about the history and the customs and the mores and the things that underlie our criminal justice system. Black people, trust me, if you study history, were criminalized from the time that slavery itself became predominant in the South, but also was present in the North. That's why it's so important, because those effects have lasted and continue to manifest in our court system.
Well, you know, I don't think anybody who's ever spent a couple of hours in a juvenile court or misdemeanor court can fail to see the effect of the skin color of the people who are coming through, lead and shackles and the folks who wear these coats and ties. But it's also, I think, a mistake to overlook the point you raised very early on about political power. The people who live in subsidized housing that are easy to pick on are poor people who live in housing authorities. I and millions of other middle-class Americans live in federally subsidized housing. I have ever since I bought my house and got a mortgage. The federal government helped subsidize my mortgage. Members of the Bush family lived in totally subsidized housing when they were governors, and governor of Florida, governor of Texas, and in the White House. I believe some of those folks had children who committed criminal acts away from the premises. It wasn't part of the deal when they got their housing that they'd be kicked out. And and when the Supreme Court looked at this Rucker case, one of the things that Justice Rehnquist said was, "Oh, this is just a standard lease term, so what's the big deal?" Essentially, and I asked the research assistant, go to every big city, go to the real estate board, and get their standard leases. There's not one city in the country that has a standard lease with a form that says, if your child commits a crime 200 miles away, that's grounds for eviction. But that's the HUD lease term, and there are people who get kicked out of public housing because their kids in college 10 states away and get picked up for a crime, and they get evicted because of it. So, we say to the people without political power, nicely track black and brown, and also obviously track poor. You know, we're going to hold you to the highest moral standard we can think of, because if you want to take the first penny from us, you've got to be exemplary. But it's easy to overlook the ways in which people with political power also benefit from the government. But of course, you know, if it was a condition of getting a tax deduction for your mortgage that your child never had to commit a criminal act, goodness gracious, would you hear a fuss?
Yeah, we tell the poor that, well, you're not worthy of this housing, but if you're gonna be here, you better not let anyone do anything wrong, even get suspended from school. Because if we find out, we're gonna kick you out. But yet, I have a mortgage, you have a mortgage, and I know as a child, I did some things that could have gotten my parents kicked out if they had the same requirements. And I probably wouldn't be here with you today if that had happened. So I go back to the question, I'm gonna come to you, but why are we allowing these type of policies to be in place in the first place? Why aren't we challenging these policies? And how can we use the information that we got today to challenge these norms, these laws, these policies? How can we hold our legislators accountable for how they mistreat certain subgroups, subsets of people? I think that that's something that is good for us. That's the kind of conversation we need to have, because it was a tremendous amount of information, but now I want to apply it.
Am I answering the first question or that one? Because they're both good.
But you
I briefly, the first part about why we see such overrepresentation, I think a lot of political power, but also on the individual level of who you know. And white families are much more likely to be able to negotiate out of an arrest situation, because police have a lot of discretion to do what's right. And if they see that a youth comes from a good home, then they're more likely to not arrest. And this isn't intentionally racist, but when you see, you know, two parents perhaps, and you see a house, and you see people who look like you, who you can identify with, a police officer might be more likely to not arrest. Once they do get arrested, diversion from court before they get to court, much more likely to happen. For both, it's a class issue, but also a race issue. And in terms of why we don't do anything about this, because everybody's afraid. There's a lot of misinformation about kids. The average American thinks that juvenile crime has been rising every year. It's been sinking since 1994. You know, it's at historic lows. But we're still in a panic mode. You know, and we have people, I mean, you have suburban dwellers moving to gated communities and putting surveillance cameras up. We're all in a state of fear. You know, I'm sorry, I don't want to get on a soapbox, but when I lived in New York City a long time ago, and when I remember I was there, and I used to live in Harlem, and when Mayor Giuliani, for years, he refused to address the black community in New York. And then, in about 6 years as mayor, he finally did. He had a town hall meeting up in Harlem, and it was right around the corner from where I lived. So I go in this auditorium, and I studied the criminal justice system, and I'm in there really eager, and I think I'm the only white person in this audience, and I'm thinking, okay, they're gonna, you know, get at him for all the unfairness and the racial profiling, and the first person who asks the question, this elderly black woman, stands up and says, "You talk about quality of life crimes. What about the quality of our lives? My grandkids have to walk past drug dealers every day on their way to school. What are you going to do about it?" And he says, "We're arresting as many as we possibly can." And almost every other question was about law and order, and we want more arrests. So from, you know, both sides, or I guess not just two sides, but across the spectrum, for perhaps different reasons, people are afraid and they want more of this. They're not challenging their politicians, they want more of it.
Well, that's problematic. And my first experience with juvenile court, I went into a court, and I had a client that was involved with a fight at school. And so I was sitting down with my client. First of all, I personally choose to not sit up in the elitist area with the other attorneys and chum them up. I sit back there with my client because I want my client to know that I don't feel that I'm above him or her. So I'm back there with my client, and then this little tiny kid comes up with his parent and the attorney, and the judge said, "Son, do you know why you're here?" He said, "Tuggy your arm." Nobody knows what he said. So the judge said, "Son, what did you say? Tuggy your arm?" So the judge was somewhat perplexed. And then at that point, the court counsel said, Your Honor, I believe he's saying tugging an arm. Well, after further discussions, we realized what happened. The young man had a temper tantrum in school, and he couldn't have been no more than 6 years old. So he had a temper tantrum in school. Teacher couldn't control it. Principal came up, tried to console the kid. The child pulled the principal's jacket. She immediately filed assault on government official charges, which is an A1 misdemeanor, the highest misdemeanor in the state of North Carolina. So you have a 6-year-old kid that's about that tall saying tuggy at arm. My heart sank. I was just so, it was so disheartening. I would say, I would never come back to this place again. This has taken 5 years off my life, because when you go to juvenile court, arguably it's a microcosm of all the ills in our society. You see it manifest itself through these young people. They're coming from poor backgrounds, impoverished backgrounds. They are having academic struggles. They live in poverty. They live in public housing, some of them. Some of them don't have parents. Some are in foster care. Some live with their grandmother. Some, they don't have father figures. And they don't know how to deal with all of that stress. Imagine witnessing your mom being abused every day, and you have to come to school as if everything is okay. You better fit in that box, or we're going to banish you from school, right? Imagine not having anything to eat. The only meal you get is that meal you get, that free lunch you get at school. So you come to school with all these issues, all this stress, and then your way of responding is the way you see it at home. Mommy and her boyfriend, they fight. So when I have to deal with adversity, I fight. And then at that point, you're punished because you're mimicking what you see at home. We don't want to recognize that there are problems in the home and that these kids bring those issues with them to school. We just want to get them out of the school. First of all, they're going to bring down our end-of-year exam scores, which is going to impact our bonuses and impact whether or not we are considered a high-performing school. Second of all, they're not worthy of being in our schools or in our public housing. Third, they are of a color that historically hasn't been really embraced in this country. They are either brown or black. They are males, they are threats, they rape, they kill, they pillage, they burn, they do everything bad that we know of. And so my question, I know I have to stop, is do we even need a juvenile justice system as we currently know it? 30 to 70% of the kids that come through the system have mental health issues. I will argue more than that have some type of educational issue. I'll argue that most of them come from single parent homes. They come from poverty. Am I, as a judge, I just ran for a judgeship. I didn't, but I'm a judge. Do I know what's best for this child? Who am I to tell this family that your child is bad, therefore detention or the youth prison? Who am I? As a juvenile defender, do I know how to best represent this child? I haven't considered the collateral consequences of a juvenile adjudication. I got 100 cases. I got to get rid of this one. He's guilty. Plead him out. Next thing you know, 10 years later, he can't get a job. He can't go to college. So the question I have for you all in my short little bit of time is, should we even continue the system that is so oppressive, that marginalizes so many people, that discounts the realities that these young people have? If we know the system is not any good, there aren't any good positive outcomes by utilizing the system, then why do we maintain it? Should we abolish it, deconstruct it, and reconstruct it in a just way? Or should we just sit back and let it go? Because that's not my kid. My kid's not gonna be the child going through the system. And if he is, then I know the judge, I know a public defender, I know the prosecutor, I can get them all off the hook. It's not, I'm not just throwing it out there. I want to know, what do y'all think? Because we wouldn't have collateral consequences if we didn't have truancy laws, if we didn't have juvenile justice, not child welfare, but juvenile justice systems. We wouldn't have collateral consequences. So what should we do? We wouldn't have families being evicted from their homes.
I think we could get a long way if we used a lot of those resources, educating the adults that are in the picture. Because I truly believe, especially administrators and school and educators could cut back a lot on the kinds of referrals that end up in juvenile court if they understood how to listen and communicate with young people instead of being afraid of them. I think that we have a control problem. I think people who are in positions to lead and to supervise young people don't understand them. I don't think that they give them the opportunity to communicate and a dialogue back and forth to the extent that young people even understand what it is that they've done when they get referred for these kinds of things.
I mean, do you really think a 6-year-old knows that tugging at arm would subject them to juvenile court?
No, no. I think we're afraid of youth. We're afraid to lose control, and that's why we end up these kids end up in the predicaments that they do.
Shall we limit the jurisdiction? Right now, North Carolina is 6 to 16. I would argue, and I did initially, and then I just completely went off course. But I would say that since the research is clear that our brains don't fully develop until we're around 25, juvenile court should be for kids aged 18 to 25. And unless you commit a serious offense, a serious felony, that's the only time you should be in court anywhere. So I guess I'm idealistic and revolutionary in my thinking, but let's just get rid of the system. If we know it doesn't work, why are we keeping it?
I think we have to get rid of the unnecessary use of the system. I think that's the bigger problem, is that we're overusing the system as the de facto mental health system and as the way to control the kids that the parents possibly can't control. And as a result, we have so many people in the system that we're not able to do the system effectively. So I think what will happen is if we decide that we don't need this type of system anymore, more kids are going to be treated as adults and more kids are going to be more harshly punished because now you have a system where you're using all those resources for mental health and education, and anything that's considered criminal then is treated far more harshly than what our juvenile system is supposed to provide, the treatment and rehabilitation that we think is.
Rehabilitation, that was taken out in 1999, right, Mrs. Zagrod? In North Carolina, at least, we don't rehabilitate our many terrorists. We just punish them.
What I was going to say is, as a culture, and I think it's important to pull back, we're using the juvenile justice system as the biggest collateral consequence of failed domestic policies. And as a culture, because all we're hearing about is poverty, mental health issues, those things can all be remedied if we so chose. But we don't as a culture. We're saying it's okay. We're going to allow entire groups of people to live in a level of poverty that we go and advertise on television justifies our need to give them money when we don't care. So, Save the Child in Bolivia gets more attention than Save the Child in Detroit, right? But we don't want to make those social allocations or resources. When we did the one strike and you're out, it was also when we ended welfare, right? 2 years and you're out on welfare. So we're saying it's okay for you to be poor, and it's a fascinating thing to say when there's no job. So that's point one. Point two is, as a culture, we love to punish. We have a big inner sadist And we really think that the best way to deal with things is by allocation to the police, by delegation to the police and to the criminal justice systems. It is a very sick love affair. Not every community has this, not every culture has this, but we have it big time. And we can't even see it. It's so naturalized to us. And then the third thing is something Martin Luther King said. In his letter from a Birmingham jail, he wrote about how angry he was that people felt in the white community that he shouldn't be leading these marches. And he said something that I come back to all the time. He said, in this culture, we prize order over justice. And our very skewed sense of order, like you're not behaving at school, you're not conforming, and frankly, much as race is a big issue in North Carolina, it's class in Maine, it's class in Vermont, it's class in New Hampshire. Terrible things are happening to white kids there too, just because of class being so preeminently the need to stratify that group. We prize order over justice, and until that is ever reversed and these kind of cultural approaches change, I don't see this system ever working for kids. It'll just resort them into other boxes. And to your point, Barry Feld has written very eloquently about the need to destroy the system. It's not doing what it's created to, and it's embarrassing to be part of it, and it's embarrassing to be an American often, for me, to see what we're doing to so many kids.
I was just going to add, I mean, it goes back, though, to the issue of political will. Yes, I mean, should we? Yes. And I think that's why we're all here, because we don't like the system or the way it's working, and we want to figure out how to address that. And if, you know, I could manage the legislature of my state or of the country, I would give them something totally different. And I guess my question in the interim is, do we chip away at the little pieces?
Yep.
Do we just keep doing these little things, you know, or do we throw in the towel and say we're not even going to participate? You know, those seem to be the choices at this point.
No, my call is to revolution. My call is that we rebel, that we have a right to, if our system is unjust, to deconstruct it and reconstruct it in a just way. My charge to you all, speakers, authors, to try to infuse class and race into your articles, so that when the practitioner reads it, he or she has a way to utilize that information to be a better advocate for his or her client. Also, go out, if you haven't already, go out into the community and teach the community. I'm quite sure there are a lot of people in public housing that may not understand the true ramifications of your child acting out in school. And if they did, they may change their behavior in their homes. They may not curse and fight as much. And I'm not stereotyping, I hope I'm not, but they may not engage in some of the behaviors that may lead to their children acting out. If we know that kids who are habitually truant aren't getting the services in the education they need in the school, let's not penalize those children and those parents. Let's help them, embrace them, and find a way to support them. And, you know, Dean Rivkin, you know, I've read your articles, and you're a wonderful writer. If you had the opportunity to go out into the community and tell kids, you know, this is what may happen to you if you're truant, I say do it. I say let's step outside of our offices and embrace the community so they would know, so they could also hear this information. I would have loved to have seen this whole place filled up with community people, but sometimes you don't, you know, institutions of higher education, they're not very open to folk in the community, and well, that's the perception. So take your information and spread it, because everything you said today is awesome. I mean, it's relevant, it's necessary. I learned a lot, and I appreciate you all taking the time out of your busy schedules to come to Durham. I hope you enjoy the weather. I might go out and run 2 miles. I don't know. Enjoy your stay here, and I appreciate everything you do, and keep on doing the good work. Thank you.